Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special episode of the CTF Weekly Recap. This is your ever wonderful host, Bosuke here, joined by the regular desk group for once. We actually have everyone together. All it took was us taking a break for a week. Go figure. We also have Industrious in the studio, unfortunately. Anyways, though, I'd like to introduce everyone here. Miski.
Hey everyone, this is Miski, same guy as 2 weeks ago, just tangled up in some lights and got a hat on now.
All right. Renee.
Hi, I'm Renee. It's almost Christmas. Yay, holidays are coming. But for now, we have recaps for you.
Always wonderful to have recaps for the holiday season. And of course, this fine fellow here with us is Carson, better known these days as Ruska.
Howdy, CTFers. This is Carson. Maybe still on Ruska, hopefully not for long, but I'm glad to be here.
All right. So, we've got, as I mentioned, a very special episode today because we're trying to recap 2 weeks worth of episodes here. 2 weeks worth of matches, rather, but also doing 2 weeks worth of episodes in one should be a fun little challenge for everyone here on the desk. But we've got a lot of exciting matches, admittedly, and a few more from week 5 than from week 6 to recap. And they've really shaken up the standings here going into the last few weeks of the season one here for the CTF teams scene. And I think we ought to take the time as well to look at how standings have shaped up and how the results have been over these last few weeks. So, for starters, in week 5, we had Delta Force surprisingly beat out the Baguettes 2-1, handing them their first ever loss. Olympus did win a relatively calm 2-0 against Fotia, although Fotia were able to hold them to one capture on the first map. And then Annihilation was barely able to squeak out a nail biter on the third map against the Roxer Seas, although the third map was a little lopsided. It was anything but for the first two maps. Crusaders also battled it out against Team Fallen in a surprisingly competitive game as both teams traded blows, and ultimately TC did come out on top 2-0, but both maps were very competitive. Moving on to week 6, I think everyone's settled down a bit for these matches. Olympus and Annihilation played the showstopper of the week, the closest match, and also probably the most typed up one. Olympus was able to pull out a win 2-0 against Annihilation in a match that has massive ramifications for our standings. Both maps were competitive, but Olympus definitely did look like the better team overall on the day. Citrix won an interesting game, to say the least, against Fotia. Not at all plagued by map restarts or anything of the sort. And then Delta Force and the Roxer Seas were able to handle the Crusaders and Team Fallen pretty handily. I think it's fair to say, in both cases, the matches being a little more one sided than the others that week. With that said, definitely a lot of results to talk about. We're not going to go over every single match in detail because that would take a little bit too long. Uh, but we are going to try to get through a lot of matches in this recap here in a short span of time. And the hosts notice in advance, but we are limiting them to 1 minute per answer. And I will be cutting them off if they go over that minute. So everyone better get their answers in pretty quick here. We're going to be starting here shortly. Mitski. We're going to start on Annihilation against the Roxer Seas. Sorry, this is for Carson. Annihilation versus Roxer Seas. What surprised you the most about the way Roxer Seas played in that match?
Oh boy, I'm on the clock here now. I think in that match, the biggest thing that stuck out to me was the way that Rox's defense really shut down our offense on Annihilation. They roamed really well on low rise, and I was really surprised by how they stamped out almost all the recovery efforts from Annihilation in that big stalemate on low rise, and they held it down really well in Desert Strike 3 as well. Definitely, Rox's defense was the biggest standout for me.
All right, only 30 seconds on that one. Good standard to set. We're going to move on to Miski. Miski, who was your standout player in that match? Which player had the biggest impact?
For me, it has to be Cardona. First two maps are a little rough from us, and then come out map 3, Cardona gets cap right away, gets things rolling, and I believe he got one or two more as well. So for me, it's definitely him. He kind of carried the team's energy a little bit in comms as well during that. So, yeah.
Yeah, everyone definitely taking the short time span to heart here. We're moving right along to a question we're going to have at the end of each recap here that we talk about. Renee, if you had to assign a rewatch value to this game for the people going back over the last couple weeks and looking at maybe watching a game again, how exciting was this game? Would you recommend rewatching it? Score from 1 to 10, and why?
I would definitely recommend rewatching it. As far as a numerical score, I would probably give it a 7 or an 8. So I'll give it a 7.5 just to kind of balance two values out a little bit. I think sheerly for the fact that Annie pulled such an amazing comeback in Castle Caverns on that third map, it was truly a sight to be seen, and how quickly they were able to take a hold of that lead again, even though the first two maps were perhaps a little bit uncertain, and a lot of people thought that Rox was going to top Annie, but no, the final blow came in that third map. So I think it's very, very, very worth rewatching.
All right. Well, fun fact, no one took over 35 seconds, so that's a good sign for our hosts already. We're going to move on now to one of the showstoppers of that first week. TB playing Delta Force, TB coming in favored, pretty heavily favored, in fact. DF coming in with a 1-3 record and pulling off the upset. So, there's a lot of talk about that match at the time. What do you think changed for TB going into that game, Carson? What do you think was the biggest deciding factor that stopped them from continuing to be an unbeaten team?
I think it has to be their roster coming in. I had heard about their scheduling issues that they had and how it had been scheduled for maybe a Saturday match, and then they at the last minute got switched to Sunday, and then they lost the availability of Chewy, their main pyro, as well as BM5, their archer. And I think those are two extremely, extremely key insta-kill classes and players to have on those classes for TV's defense. BM5 especially for his communication and just coordination in general on defense. I also think that their offense may not have had the best supporters as well. Rongerbox is usually a solid teammate to have on offense. Maybe not always a capper role, but definitely a good teammate. And he was on the pyro role, so that little mix up for them may have caused some failures on the end of their defense.
Yeah, with that said, the game was still very close most of the way through. Definitely a match that kept people on their seats until the end, but map 3, much like in the Annihilation matchup, was where one team truly ran away with the game, and that team was DF. Miski, what do you think was the key factor that allowed Delta Force to pull ahead on map 3?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall a ton of their players just really stepped up on the third map. We saw Obi and DTJ roaming a lot more than the previous maps. I think Obi actually killed the Pyro on their first cap on that map as well. And then Pig 3 had a monster game on that map, and Code was not far behind with some of the recoveries he got at and past mid.
Yeah, definitely a lot of impact from the roaming and defense, I think it's fair to say. Lastly, here, Renee, again, we're on you. Um, Going back and looking at that game, would you recommend that people rewatch it? What do you think?
Yes, 100%. In my personal opinion, if I were to give this, a number on a scale, I would probably give it a 10 because it was one of the most, if not the most interesting match to kind of see in round 5. And there was always something at stake. Like you couldn't tell who was going to go forward or who was going to go backwards in terms of taking a lead. So everyone was like really, really hyping it up, in CTF general chat and even in the live stream chat and in multiple live stream chats. In this case, we had some people updating us as TC and TF were playing. So I definitely think it is worth the rewatch and to really kind of analyze what worked and what didn't for both teams.
All right. So, moving us right on along now, then. And yes, I definitely agree. That is a match to watch. TC played Team Fallen in week 5 as well, and that game did end up being pretty close between two teams that I believe at the time were still searching for their first win. So, both teams came to play that day. TC ended up winning. Renee, you might have had a little bit of personal experience in this one. What gave TC the edge?
Yeah, just a little bit of personal experience. I think what happened and what was the real momentum changer is how our offense and defense finally kind of started being more cohesive with one another. For example, on low rise specifically, offense was having a really really hard time getting out because XXXX was just there every time as Pyro, and props to him because he did so good. And it finally took a push of the ninjas forward to knock him out for us to get that first cap and finally get that kind of flow going and that cohesiveness that we'd been looking for all that time. So that really, really helped, and I think it kind of gave us more confidence to really do what we felt comfortable with and what we were most accustomed to.
All right. Yeah, definitely very good to hear. Love to see it when a team really comes together. Miski, there were a lot of crazy moments in that match. It did feel very back and forth, even going on to Desert Strike. If you had to pick one moment, though, what would you call the craziest in that entire game?
For me, it has to be that G Henry recovery at the end. I mean, it's tied 2-2. This is their chance to get their first map win and potentially start looking towards a map win. And G Henry comes all the way around the side of the map, comes in from above and gets the recovery. They win the game, and TC takes the 2-0 victory.
Yeah, definitely a wild moment on stream since it appeared as if he came out of nowhere for the viewers. Um, Speaking of which, Carson, looking back on that game, what do you think makes it worth a rewatch? Is it worth a rewatch? What score would you give it?
I think it's definitely worth a rewatch. I think for a lot of these matches in the season, we may get bogged down by some games that aren't as competitive and things like that, where the skill level and the differential between the two teams in any given match has been significantly higher and maybe not as entertaining. But for this match in particular, I think I would rate it at least an 8 or a 9 for sure. Some crazy plays from G Henry and big assassinates from Vexicle. Some entertaining moments all around for sure. It's very unique.
All right, moving us right on along now. We're on week 6. Annihilation played Olympus in the top billing, I think it's fair to say, of that weekend in particular, especially since TB was not playing. So, between those two teams, we did see a pretty competitive game. But in the end, Olympus was able to win out 2-0 with a big recovery at the end of map 2 to really seal things down and allow for their second cap. There were a bunch of different matchups across the board in that match, but I was curious, Carson, which of them did you think was the most impactful?
I think, yeah, you're right that there were a lot of interesting points to talk about there, but I think the biggest one that I noticed, at least as a viewer on stream, and unfortunately not being able to play for Annihilation for another reason, but I definitely noticed a lot of bulk recov on Olympus's part, getting to the flag carrier, specifically on Pagodas and Slate as well, obviously getting the recov there at the end. But I think the amount of recov that Olympus was coordinating and their forces to get the flag back just simply outweighed the pressure that Annihilation and our roaming was doing against that recovery effort. I think that their recov was really strong in those stalemates.
All right, and Renee, both teams I think are going to look on back on that game and try to take some lessons away, as it's going to be one of the last matchups we have between top seeded teams or teams that are on the higher end of the standings so far this year. With that in mind, if you had to yeah, find one takeaway for either team, what takeaway would that be and which team would it be for?
Um, I would say a takeaway for Olympus, and I'll switch it up because they were the ones that won. A takeaway for them specifically would be to don't celebrate a quick cap prematurely, as it might cost you. As we saw, Dave got a ninja cap almost within under a minute, I believe. And I think perhaps everyone on Olympus's side got really, really excited about that, but that allowed a little bit of uh openness in their flag room and perhaps not as much preparedness as they'd want to have for Cardona to come in and grab a really, really quick elf steal and get that going. And then again, and get Annie's first cap within the first 2 minutes, like almost immediately after that ninja cap. So I think celebrating is good, but in moderation, especially at something that has such high stakes.
All right, just barely beating out that 1 minute mark there. Very nicely done. Miski, what do you think? Is that match worth going back and rewatching, even for someone maybe on the losing side of it?
I think this match is definitely rewatchable, and I don't think it's for like conventional reasons. I think this is a match where gameplay overall was pretty high level, and I think this is a game that people can really look back and actually learn something from. And I know even going over my own gameplay from that, I've learned a lot from kind of seeing how their defense is playing and whatnot in the match itself. So I definitely think this is rewatchable, but maybe for different reasons of the other matches we've covered so far.
All right, and the last match we're going to talk about today is the one between Citrix and Fotia that took place in week 6. A lot of different storylines coming into that game, and actually pretty good viewership from what we saw. Unfortunately, some technical issues took place as well, but we still got a pretty exciting and entertaining game. A game where Pesto even managed to capture the flag. So, speaking of Fotia's membership, Renee, what do you think the impact of all of Fotia's new pickups was?
Yeah, so out of the four major pickups that they had, three of which actually played in that match. So we kind of got to see their skills firsthand and how they blended in with that team. So we saw Haynes on Ninja Defense, Boss Adam on Assassin, and then Average on a more Chemist and Elf based offensive push and roll. So I think all of them really kind of showcase their individual talents and how they could contribute to the team. I think Haynes and Boss Adam did a really, really great job with some clutch recovs, especially having sometimes a little bit of a laggy ping does often help with Assassin because people don't time it quite right, so it can benefit him in that way. And then I think Average did a really, really great job showcasing his opportunities on offense as well, and showing that he's a really, really formidable asset to that team now.
All right, and Carson Citrix, despite our talkativeness about Fotia, did end up winning that match. They did so convincingly, I think it's fair to say. Fotia put up a fight, but it definitely wasn't enough. So, in that match, what did you find Citrix's biggest edge over their competition to be?
I think, in my opinion, one of their biggest advantages was their ability to keep their offense together, especially well on Pagoda's 3 and Slate as well, on both of the maps that they played. But namely Pagoda's 3, because it seemed like in a 10v10 scenario that they were playing with no Def Medic on Fotia's side, I definitely think that getting all of the offense there on time to really knock out the threat of the Pyro and just eliminate any other flag room threats potentially was really impactful for them. They definitely did kind of take advantage of the maybe less impactful roaming of Fotia, but I think that overall their coordination and sticking together really helped them secure some simpler and maybe like more straightforward caps on Pagoda's 3.
All right, and lastly here, Miski, you got to ref that game. It was anything but a smooth ride, but in terms of rewatch value, where would you place it? What kind of match are we looking at here?
I'd say it's like a 6 or a 7 maybe, and the reason being, I definitely think it's an interesting match to watch. I think this is a match we'll go back and kind of be like, what was going on map 1? Where there's so many pauses, resets, etc. But I think overall, for me, it's just nice watching Fotia in general improve throughout the season. And this match, even though they lost, they did kind of showcase some of those strengths that they've been building up. So I think overall this is a good match to watch, and all of Fotia's matches so far have been pretty good to watch.
Yeah, and obviously looking forward to an exciting match from them next week as well. With that said, we're going to move right on along here. We've got some roster moves to talk about since we missed the roster lock deadline in our absence last week. Uh, a number of teams making notable additions. We did touch on Fotia earlier, but I think it's also worth starting on Team Fallen here, who have a pretty brief window of time now to turn their season around. They did lose some members, notably IQN, but they have added a new player to the roster as well, Kiarana. So, Carson, what can we expect from them, and what do you think of that potential roster swap from Team Fallen?
I definitely was pretty satisfied with IQN's performance in the matches that he did play. Um, I know that he was primarily a defender on their team. He played Pyro a little bit, but I believe he was primarily a ninja player. And I also do know that Kiarana, apologies if I'm mispronouncing. I know that she is also a ninja player as well. So I'm optimistic about how they can try to fill that exact same role. It is good that they were able to kind of fill in, at least try to fill in a position that was lost when IQN left the team. So I'm excited to see what she can do in matches.
Yeah. Now, Delta Force, who had themselves a big win in week 5 and a convincing follow up victory against TC as well, they made some roster swaps that we did get to see playtime from in week 6. Notably, Mystic Mad and Ormelt have left the team, We know Oramelt in particular is leaving to focus on her studies, so best of luck to Oramelt on that. And Snowbreak and Cupcake have been added to the roster. They did get to play in Week 6 against a TC roster. They did win that game convincingly. Mitski, what do you think about those swaps, though? Do you think DF has gotten an upgrade overall, or maybe lost some value from Mystic, Mad, and Oramelt?
I think overall this is a net positive, and reason being, I think DF is a team who has a lot of depth at Ninja and Bulk, which was the role that Mystic was playing. So losing her, although they don't want to lose her, they do have people to come up and kind of fill that. But them getting Snowbreak and Cupcake back is huge. These are two players who I was very concerned for DF when I didn't see them on their active roster at the start of the season. And yeah, sure, they're rusty now. They had maybe a little bit of an easier match recently, but these are both players who have taken breaks and come back in the past and still ended up being top players coming out of it. So I'm very excited for the future of DF, and I definitely think this is a positive for them.
And speaking of futures, no team has been busier than Fortia in the last couple of weeks. I do want to highlight that they've made some additions since the roster lock as well, notably Zcause and Pavkin joining the roster. Unfortunately for them, they're not going to be able to play in Season 1 because of the roster lock taking place before they were able to join the team. However, that didn't stop them from picking up 4 other players before the roster lock actually went into place. Haynes, Bossatom, Zingis, and Averged are all now rostered, and the only player they dropped in that span of time was Cheese CX. So, Renee, I asked you about them earlier in that context of that particular match. What do you think about them overall? How does that change Fotia's look going forward in the season?
Yeah, so I think it really, really helps them on a ninja front. I think by having Haynes, they're gonna get a little bit stronger in that aspect. I think that by having Bossanum, I think that his assassin gameplay will be very, very crucial to them, especially seeing how many clutch recovs and like great assassinates he got in their match against CX. He places himself in a very, very good position. And I think that that is really, really important to have someone who kind of knows the mechanisms of the game and knows where to predict where people are going. As well as I believe, forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, I think it's Zingis. I think is a very, very a good asset on bulk defense. And as I mentioned before, average is has a lot of potential, especially playing on Elf and Chemist, which he has been working on casual quite frequently. So he's definitely putting a really good effort into helping them improve by himself improving.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of exciting additions there for Fotia going forward. We're interested to see how they do, obviously, in this coming week. Apparently, Renee has bread. That's very concerning. And I hate to transition off of that in such an awkward way, but we do have an interesting segment here coming up. We're going to have a call in for the first time on the show from a community member. Hopefully, we'll be able to do a few more of these in the future. But for the time being, we have a very special and very welcome guest to add to the show. Everyone, please give it up for our wonderful guest, Mr. The Spartan 33, who is now here on the line with us. Spart, hello, welcome to the show.
What's up, guys? Thanks for having me.
Congratulations again on the big win a couple weeks ago against the Buggets. Congratulations as well uh,
Mhm.
for your win against TC.
Thank you.
Um, so, we have you on the show. You got the
Mhm.
mic? I'm going to make
Um,
this pretty open ended today. What do you want to talk about?
I mean, obviously the past 2 weeks, the TB match was probably the highlight. Um, that or the only highlight I can think of, really. Um, I already kind of talked about the match a little bit after um the game ended, obviously, but I kind of want to go into more detail about what happened. To first kind of summarize, it seemed like TB had the game in their hands. Like they should have won the first 2 games, like hands down. They had mid control on low rise, they had mid control on Desert Strike, but they weren't really able to push their advantage well enough to like help their offense out and get caps, right? I'll start with low rise. Um, I think yeah, from the start to the ends, they owned mid control, and like mid control is like a huge I honestly think it's the meta. Like whoever controls mid pretty much controls the pace of the game. And like it's just very hard to come to play against that pressure, because if you have mid control, you're forcing the other team to make mistakes and whatnot. So I was honestly surprised they didn't like 3-0 DF because they were just owning mid. Um, and I think a lot of that could be their ninjas when they were roaming up on offense. They weren't really doing anything productive or efficient to help their offense. Like maybe the timing was off. They weren't there when the offense was there. Um, they were dying too easily to the DF roam. Who knows? I can't really say because I wasn't playing defense that game. But Desert Strike was kind of the same thing. They still had mid control, but it was hard for them to press on offense or to help their offense because it's such a large map. And like even with the sponges, like it takes so much time to get to the other side of the map and help your team. I think Azel, I think he had almost like 90 kills, so like they were like they should have been able to press their advantage, but they just weren't able to. Um and then the third map, that's when it got really interesting because I think that's the first time that I've seen at least TV get just completely outplayed. Like usually you like I can kind of like make a comparison to like boxing or fighting, MMA, mixed martial arts, whatnot. TB is usually the aggressor. They're usually the one dictating the pace of the fight, right? Um, and it seems like in the third map that it was like the opposite. Like they weren't aggressive, or they were aggressive, but it's like they were fighting like a good counter puncher. Like DF was able to kind of counter their overextension, their over aggressiveness, and able to kind of quickly pick up the pace on offense. Like I'm trying to think. Uh oh yeah, of course, mid control. Castle Caverns mid control. TB was just they just didn't have it that map, and honestly, it was pretty surprising because usually they're pretty consistent in killing the offense, but I think it was a combination of Necro and its ability to absorb pressure, and also Delta Force's roam actually performing as well as the other teams from TB's roam. And they were able to, sometimes get 6, 7 people in the flag room and just completely overwhelm them. And then I think that kind of created a panic, and TB's not really used to playing against that or playing from behind. So it was pretty interesting to see that. But yeah, I mean, mid control, mid control, mid control. That's the that's the name of the game, pretty much. At least that's the way I see it. But
Yeah, well,
yeah.
very interesting to hear that analysis from a first-person perspective. Had
Mhm.
not heard at all about that Hazel stat, so that is news to me at the very least, and very interesting to hear.
All right.
Um, again, love to see the emphasis on mid control. It's a very important part of our game. And did you want to add anything else?
Um, I'm not sure. I think the one major takeaway is from this game is that I don't think TB has like fallen from their status as the number one team. They clearly are, but I think they're no longer like head and shoulders above everyone else. Like I think that game kind of showed that they're beatable. I think you can make a game plan to counter them, to at least play. If you have the right pieces, you can play as well as them, if not beat them. So I think it'll be really interesting heading into playoffs to see which teams can, you know, um, kind of use this game as a blueprint against TB in case they face them. You know, so it'll be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Now, my understanding as well was you had some thoughts on the meta that you wanted to share with us briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of already touched on that. The I think mid control is the most important thing in the game. Again, like, and those classes that control the mid control would have to be archer and pretty much your 2 or 3 roaming classes. Like I think there's a reason why a lot of like the top players in the game, they all play either like archer or ninja or scout assassin. Like those players and those roles have the most impact on the game, you know. So like it doesn't really matter if you have like the best offense on paper, like you have a stud offense. If the other team has a good roam, like it's a more impactful role, and like it's you can just control the game. If you control mid, you control or you help out your defense, your core defense, because no one's getting there, right? So the pyro might only have to kill like one person, maybe two people, and that also enables your offense because you're roaming up to help them and get more captures. So it's like everything in the game pretty much revolves around that, you know. So and TB is the team that has kind of matched that meta, which is it explains why they're so great right now, or they've been great for like the past year. So
Yeah, definitely a big component of their success in the past, and it was very cool to see Delta Force really take control of the game that way in their matchup. So thanks again for all that insight. Before we go, you guys are heading into a bye week next week, is my understanding. How are you going to use that time?
um I mean, a lot of us are in college and school and whatnot, so we're probably gonna chill and focus on our studies. But we might, you know, go over some scrims, go over some VODs, and you know, prepare for the playoffs as well. Um, and yeah, as far as I know about that.
All right. Well, best of luck both with your studies and with your future matches. Thanks for coming on the show. And we really appreciate the analysis and having you on here with us, Spart. Thanks
Yeah, for
again.
sure. Thanks, man. See you.
All right. So, again, wonderful to have Spart on the show. Hopefully, this is something we'll be able to do more of in the future. And we'll definitely be reaching out to the community at the very least. Let us know if you're interested in the segment yourselves. And hopefully, we can set something up here with some more call ins. So, moving right along and segueing nicely into what Spart just talked about, we've had 2 weeks to sit around and look at how the meta's developed here in season one of the CTF League. I wanted to go through you guys one by one, starting with you, Mike. What was your what did we learn from these last 2 weeks? What, if anything, have we learned?
I think the absolute biggest takeaway for me is that every team from here on out needs to prepare for every match, and especially looking towards playoffs. We had a lot of we had upsets, um, close to upsets, especially on those maps in week 5, and I think it's just a lack of teams under preparing. Again, I do think that TB, with a better understanding of those maps, could have beaten DF, and I think our match versus Rock could have been a lot more one-sided if we put as much prep time as we should have into that. So the biggest thing I've noticed again is that I think the maps play a very big part in a lot of these weeks, and that's something that teams need to start looking at more.
And that's a good point because it'll segue quite nicely into our map segment when we do get to talk about that. But before that, we're going to move on to Carson here. Carson, what's your biggest takeaway from the last 2 weeks?
I think these last 2 weeks definitely highlighted the fact that, uh, and this has been the case for a good while now, but roaming has been the name of the game, and that has been such a huge meta, uh, just decider. Essentially, it's been decided the success of a lot of different teams. I know in the Annie versus Rocks match, the roaming in the big stalemates on low rise um, had definitely determined, you know, the outcome of those stalemates because Annie never got the recov. And again, teams like the TB versus DF, when you lose players like BM5 and your good roaming archers, and when your own players on Delta Force roam really well on maps like Castle Cavern, I just think that the more you can roam, the better you'll do. That's my big takeaway.
All right, lots of love for roaming these days. Definitely, again, a very integral part of the meta. Renee, how about you wrap us up here?
Yeah.
What was? Oh,
Oh, sorry.
sorry. By all means, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that at least popped into my field of vision is the comeback of Elf is kind of what I'll dub it as. I think we saw a great Elf cap, for example, from Cardona, and I think that kind of reminded me that, oh, we're seeing a lot more activity on Elf and a lot more successes on Elf captures compared to what we had originally talked about and discussed among the one of the first few recaps, and how we're seeing it kind of supposedly die out. So seeing a couple people utilize that again, and now with hopefully Carson back, we will see that even more. I really hope to kind of see it make that comeback. That'll be awesome because again, we were so down on it originally and how it wasn't being utilized in the best manner it could be. But it's coming back, so I'm really excited to see what people do with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely remember that capture from Cardona. It was also interesting to see big performances from Fatal Best in '93 as well this last week, really bringing the class back in style. '93 in particular felt like he almost ran over Team Fallen entirely by himself on that class. So very cool to see. Um, Now, we've got a fun comment from Mike there, but we've got an interesting part of our segment to talk about next. We previewed it not too long ago. It's the maps for this coming week of matches as we start to look ahead to what's going to come next. Starting us off here, Desert Strike 3, the return of the revenge of Desert Strike 3. We saw a lot of exciting matches on it in week 5. Mike, what did we learn about that map? What really stands out about it still?
I mean, personally, having played that map and having not capped it all, and seeing a lot of other players play that map and not capping it all, I've taken some time to really look at it, and routing is the most important thing on offense on that map. You're routing over to the flag. If you're playing Elf, you're playing mobility class, you need to take those high grounds. And when you're coming out of the flag, you need to be cognizant of where your medic is. The amount of times I've seen soldiers kind of just drop down or take a sponge completely away from their medic and then get singled off by ninja or something it just happened way too much. Teams need to be way more cognizant of where their players are on the map positioning wise and use it to their advantage.
All right, moving right on along here now. Airlock 1 is making a return this week as well. It's going to be one of the maps that's played the most here during the group stage. We've already seen it played twice, and we're in for another round of it guaranteed. Renee, what stands out as being the most important factor on that map to you?
Yeah, so I would say that there are two, one with respect to offense and one with respect to defense. With offense, you need to learn to adjust your team structure accordingly because oftentimes, if you have too many lightweight classes going into Airlock One, you're gonna suffer immensely. You're basically gonna see a lot more damage inflicted, especially since Airlock One is such a PvP heavy and that kind of based map. You're going to suffer again if you don't adjust accordingly and get more of that bulkier offense to infiltrate the flag room. On a defensive measure, however, you also need to consider trying to restrict the opposing offense into the interior of Airlock's map. As soon as more mobile classes get on top, it is so difficult for an archer to kind of work their way around, especially if they're not running an archer on the first place. It's very hard to adjust. So therefore, kind of consolidating or coaxing that offense into taking the interior route is crucial for a possible recovery, and it's something that really needs to be taken into consideration each and every time.
Yeah, definitely. Very important point there made by Renee. And we're going to wrap up here with Carson. Carson, um, we've got Harvest 2 rather, coming up. Now, this map was not played in the draft team's tourney, if memory serves, but its cousin Harvest 1 was. And to date, those are our only examples of it being seen in serious competitive play. We did have the map scheduled for week 3, but no teams made it to map 3 in week 3. So, assuming we get to Harvest 2 this time around, what should we expect?
Yeah, it's a little awkward having not seen this map at all ever until the 7th week of the season, but I definitely think that we can at least draw some opinions about it from what we've seen in the draft tourney on Harvest 1. I know that in the draft tourney, Chemist was really strong, so along with Elf, and Chemist may not be as strong here due to its recent nerf, but I do think that mobility classes are going to perhaps dominate the offensive end, and I definitely know that it's almost like an adrenaline type map where if you can get out of the flag as fast as you can and get to mid, you're almost home free at that point. And I think that's going to be what a lot of teams are going to try to do here. Just avoid taking the any more time than necessary, especially getting out of the flag room with the kind of narrow tunnels in and around the flag.
Yeah, definitely some good things to look out for there on Harvest 2. Very excited to see that map played as I had a hand in making its predecessor at the very least. So will be interesting to see how that goes down. Moving right on along here, we've got to talk about how the playoff picture is shaping up now that we only have 3 weeks left in the tournament. So, with that all in mind, I'd love to pull up the standings, which is a new segment we're doing this week. Maybe the only time we do it because we normally are a weekly recap show, but this time around we've got to talk about multiple weeks. And as you guys can see, the standings have shaped up juicily. Notably, Olympus is now in first place after TB's bye week as they have more points, but TB does have a game in hand. Again, Annihilation, Delta Force, Rockstar Seas, Citrix, all fighting it out for some of the top spots. And Fotia, TC, Team Fallen, a little bit on the back foot right now, but still have room to claw back a few positions from where they are now. So, we're going to start off with that competition there at the top. Olympus currently is 2 points ahead of TB, but TB do have a game in hand against them. They, with the same number of maps played, if results go as expected, will have more map wins likely when they do tie Olympus. They will likely have a higher capture percentage should they tie Olympus. It's a very interesting situation right now, but it does still feel like even if Olympus is ahead of TB right now, TB are probably in the driver's seat for reaching that first seed overall in the tournament. Now, with that in mind, I did want to ask the desk, should we expect TB to struggle anywhere else in their schedule that might allow Olympus to catch up, quote unquote? Um, Carson, TB is
Mhm.
going to be playing the following teams. It's going to be TC, Team Fallen, and Rockstar Seeds. As you can see, no teams above the top four in our current standings. Do you think there are any opportunities for them to be able to trip up, lose a map or two, lose a match or two? What do you think?
I personally don't see any huge upsets happening in rounds 7 or 8 in those first couple of matches. I could definitely see with with the way that Rockstar Seas played against Annihilation recently and how dominant they were over Team Fallen. I could definitely see a tie or maybe losing a map to the Rockstar Seas in week 9, which may affect their standings a little bit. I'm also a little bit doubtful of an entire match upset, but it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility for week 9 there.
Yeah, that Delta Force win making things very close between Olympus and TB, a lot closer than we might have imagined them going into week 5. Now, uh, seeds 3 through 6 right now are pretty competitive. Annihilation is clearly ahead of the rest of them in terms of points, but in terms of captures, map wins, and everything else, it's pretty close between Annihilation, Delta Force, Rockstar Seas, and Citrix. And I think that's where most of our playoff seeding turmoil is going to happen in the coming weeks. Some of those teams have stronger schedules, some of them have weaker ones. And with that all in mind, I do want to run everyone through the remaining schedules for those teams. Annihilation, as you can see, has 2 matches left, Fotia and Citrix. Delta Force, they've got Fotia as well, but Team Fallen is their remaining game beyond that. Citrix have got Team Fallen, yes, but then also the Rockstar Seas and Annihilation left on their schedule. And then the Rockstar Seas have a bit of a gauntlet run of some of our top teams here. They're playing Olympus, TB, and Citrix. And I think it's fair to say there are some teams relying on them to play spoiler. But I do want to go through them one by one here. Mike, if you'll start us off, based on that schedule, what do you think Citrix's chances are of maybe even reaching that third seed?
It's definitely interesting. I mean, I do think their match to watch is going to be against my team, Annihilation. This is a match that, I mean, I generally expect us to win. So if I had to predict their chance of getting a third seed, I'd say they're pretty low. But I mean, like, objectively, like, this is definitely a match that they can win. We're a team they have beaten before. So I mean, from like a community perspective, I'd probably say it's around 50-50.
All right, 50-50. Definitely putting a lot of hype into that week 9 game. Renee, um, moving on to a different team here. The Rockstar Seeds are currently 5th in our standings. They've got a tough run of opponents ahead. Do you think they're going to be able to keep up their current pace, maybe even finish things out 3-0, or should we expect to see them falter a little bit?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, they're playing Oli, then Citrix, and then followed, last but not least, by TB, which will maybe not be the best way to end things. So, in terms of them actually coming close, I think that they are most well matched against Citrix. If there is to be an upset or some kind of flaw in our predictions, so to speak, I think that could be the opportunity to do so. I think based on their rosters individually, each of them could have the potential to upset the other. And it really just depends on who can play that day and how schedules align and seeing what works. But I think that they do have a chance to perhaps beat CX. As far as Oli and TB, I am doubtful, but I'm always open to surprises, I suppose is the best way I can put it.
If I could just follow up quickly, Carson did mention that Roxor Seas might be TB's toughest opponent left on their schedule. Do you think we could potentially see Roxor Seas maybe at least take a few captures or even a map away from TB based on how they've been playing lately?
I'd like to see that. That would be very interesting in the sense that they could, find a couple of cracks and flaws in TB's defensive system, especially, and maybe coax their way out a cap or two. As far as winning a match, it would be very, very difficult for them because, again, TB, and I think the one time off thing with DF was just a very unfortunate circumstance where their best players and their couldn't quite make it and combine their full strengths together at the same time. So I think the likelihood of them winning a match in general, not too great. However, captures, that is something I would like to see.
All right, yeah, definitely some matchups to look forward there for Roxor Seas. Do want to point out there is still a world where both Annihilation and the Rockster Seas finish the season 6-2. They don't face each other at any point remaining in the season. So that could still happen. And the determinant for third place in that scenario would come down to map win and capture tiebreakers. Notably, Roxor Seas are currently ahead in map wins with less games played. So, very interesting one to pay attention to if the Roxor Seas do end up overperforming. Now, next up on our list, we've got Delta Force. DF is a team that have only 2 matches remaining. Uh, they're 3-3, so at a 500 level, but their captures and capture percentage certainly don't speak to that. In the games they've been winning handily. So, Miski, what do you think Delta Force's chances are in their remaining games, considering, of course, that they do play Fotia and Team Fallen?
Yeah, I mean, these are two matches that we definitely expect them to win. In terms of how it's going to like impact their seeding and whatnot, I think again that Annie CX match and some of what Rox does actually does really matter. But I fully expect them to 3-0 both of those matches and more or less solidify themselves in the standings. I mean, I don't really see them going down from here in any scenario, so I'd say they're at least going to end up top four.
Yeah, only way they don't end up top 4 is if other teams end up winning out. I do want to highlight one thing for them, though. There is a scenario, of course, where they could get third place, but they're going to need to rely on Annihilation not winning their 2 remaining games. If Annie win out, there's no chance they make top 3. If the Roxor Seas, for that matter, win out, there's no way they make top 3. What they need to have happen is for Citrix to be able to beat Annihilation but lose one of their other remaining games, probably to the Roxorseas. It's a very specific scenario, but it is doable, and I did want to highlight that for Delta Force. They could perhaps break out of that 4th or 5th place scenario with some games that are actually going to be competitive, perhaps going their way. So, last up on our list, Annihilation. I'm going to make this a bit of an open question to everyone, but they've got 2 matches left. It's against Fotia and CX. For their best chance to hit that 3rd seed, they do need to win both of them. What do you guys think their chances are of pulling that off? Oh boy, I need to stop making questions open-ended. Okay, Renee, all yours.
Sure. I think it's a pretty good chance, if I'm being completely honest. I think Fotia shouldn't be too daunting to Annie, considering their experience compared to the latter. However, CX could pull something and perhaps move around their roster enough to the point where they have their strongest on hold at all times during that match. There's not too many substitutions or ping errors or anything else that might be affecting them in that sense. But I think, at least for the time being, it's probably a fair bet to say that Annie will probably be taking home those 2 wins.
All right. Well, very bullish prediction on Annihilation there. We've got a couple more teams to cover here. Fotia and TC have a very big match coming up in week 9. It's going to be perhaps the match that decides which team ends up in 7th place or which team ends up in 8th place. And that's going to be one that we'll preview in the show before that week. Probably devote a good amount of time to it because it's really going to matter for the seeding. Notably, the team that ends up in 8th place probably has a harder time in the lower bracket of the tournament if they do, as expected, lose to the 1st or 2nd seed that they play. So, a matchup that actually matters a lot. Before we get to that match, though, both Fotia and TC have 2 remaining games. They're not easy ones, to say the least, for either team. TC is going to be going up against TB and Olympus, whereas Fotia, they've got Annie and then Delta Force on their schedule. With how those teams are doing, Miski, which team do you think has a better chance of maybe taking a few matches, maps, or even captures to help their tiebreakers going into that calamitous Week 9 match?
This is definitely a tough question. I think I'm going to go with the boring answer here. I mean, I think just like statistically, I think Fotia is the better team and is ranked up against teams that are lower in the standings than TC versus TB and Ollie. So I think, like, if anything, it is Focia who's going to have that chance. And again, like I said, they have been improving every single week. So maybe they come out with something crazy this week and they're able to, come in, take a map off of us, take a map or 2 off of DF, whatever. Maybe even win a match. But if I'm betting on any team to do it, it's definitely going to be Fotia.
All right, Miski seems pretty high on Fotia. I don't think that's a difficult to defend position, is I guess the way I would put it. We do have one other team to touch on here briefly. Team Fallen currently sits at 0-5. They've got 3 of the 4 top seeded teams left on their schedule. If you look at the original seeding of teams at the start of the tournament, it's going to be TB, Delta Force, Citrix. Is there any chance that Team Fallen avoids missing the playoffs? Carson, what would their best chance be of making it?
I I don't want to be a predictor of such a bad result here, but I hope the best for them, and I am not confident though in their chances of making it into the playoffs by upping themselves to the number 8 seed here. Um, it's not something I believe. It would have to be such a huge miracle to come out with a victory in these last 3 matches, because they do have some pretty tough opponents, and I would like to see them just um, do their best to show up and finish out the season as best as they can, definitely. But That's my opinion on it, I believe.
Well, say what you will, a strong Team Fallen performance would definitely throw a wrench in a lot of teams' postseason plans. So, definitely best of luck to them going forward. And I think we've only got one or two real segments left here tonight. It's been fantastic having everyone here. We're looking ahead now to round 7, as noted before. And I want to pull up the schedule for this round because there are some matches that we probably should talk about here, and we will in our predictions in a second. TB is playing TC, as mentioned before, that matchup being between one of our higher seeded teams and lower seeded teams right now. Could still bear some interesting results, as could the matchup between Olympus and the Roxorseas, two teams that actually aren't as far apart in the standings as you might have expected them to be at this point in time in the year. So Roxorseas perhaps challenging Olympus here and looking to have a strong performance. Citrix will be playing Team Fallen, a matchup of the 4th and 9th seeds in the tournament, and then Annihilation will be closing out the majority of their season outside of their round 9 game and going into their bye week after a match against Fotia, a match where notably our good friend Carson will finally be cleared to be back in the game. So, bunch of matchups there. I think we're going to jump right into our predictions, as unfortunately they might not be the spiciest thing in the world this week. Real tragedy for our Texan fellow Carson over here. But I believe we've all predicted the same outcomes. TB over the Crusaders, Olympus over the Roxorseas, Citrix over Team Fallen, Annihilation over Fotia. With that said, our predictions are definitely not the word of God. I do want to point this out. Um, we all predicted TB against Delta Force in our last recap. We are definitely not prophets at this point in time. Carson, yeah, it's not didn't come out in favor of Delta Force that particular time. Maybe that is what saved them after all.
I agree. Yeah.
But I did want to ask everyone a question before we wrap up on the predictions here. If you had to choose between those 4 matches, where do you see the likeliest upset being? Miski, start us off.
I actually think it's going to be Olympus and Rocks. Reason being, again, we saw a almost upset with an Olympus and Rocks match in the past. Rocks nearly taking them out, getting off to a good start, and I do think Rocks has been a team that I think has honestly been overperforming in some of their games. And Olympus, again, with a little bit of a easier schedule here towards the end, maybe. I don't know. They might get caught sleeping by Rocks. That's the match I could potentially see a team kind of upsetting and taking a map or two. So yeah.
Yeah, all the more reason for Olympus to take Renee's advice. Don't fall asleep, especially if things start going well for you. Moving on here, Carson, where do you think the upset might come if it had to come somewhere?
Yeah, I definitely think that um, there's a couple of options here that I was debating between. I know that the Annihilation versus Fotia team or the match was the one where the seedings are least far apart, the smallest differential as far as team seedings. So I definitely think that there could be some surprising results there. However, Annihilation is coming back with a couple player with some people having to be able to savor the taste of freedom, maybe. But I definitely have to agree with Miski here. I think Olympus um, has a chance of faltering against Roxorseas on some of these maps in particular, where players like 93 on Rocks can really perform extremely well and at an extremely high level, especially with the way Rocks has been playing recently. Um, I could definitely see them losing some maps and perhaps even an upset overall in this next one.
All right, another call for the Olympus Roxorseas matchup. I hope you guys are right. I hope that matchup does end up being competitive. Renee, you're last up for tonight. Do you agree with them, or do you think the upset will come somewhere else?
Yeah, I don't really have a different opinion here. I'm gonna stick with these two guys because I completely agree. I think again, Olympus needs to go into the strong, not take this game for not take take it for a grain of salt. They need to really power through it. And on the bright side, when I have talked to a few Olympus members, they have reiterated to me that they are not the most excited about this match because it's their Rox has become a very formidable team, and I think they've accepted that, which might also which might help them in actually being more realistic about the match and knowing how to approach it first and foremost, as opposed to making mistakes early on and then regretting it much later. But I am seriously considering the possibility of that match to be the upset.
All right, well, that'll be a very important match, especially as Olympus tries to chase down TB in the standings and maybe whittle away at their map win and capture lead. Very important story to follow going forward. Very important story to follow with us here at the CTF weekly recap here on CMS at YouTube. So, thanks again to everyone here on the desk for joining us. Thanks again to our wonderful guest, the Spartan 33, for coming on the show. Nin, if you'd like, you can demonstrate your throne of Spartans here as provided to you by some fellow on the broadcast who's been hanging around invisible, unfortunately. What a rascally fellow putting that all together. And again, thank you to all of our viewers for joining us here on this extra special episode of the CTF Weekly Recap. We hope everyone enjoyed it. We hope we did a good enough job of covering these last 2 weeks, and we hope you stick with us for the foreseeable future. We've got some great matches coming up as the Season 1 of the CTF League enters its final stage. Be sure to tune in. Thank you, guys.
I'm cutting dice. Look at these eyes. They're not here to please you. There was a time